The overhead lights of Boston Logan International Airport burned cold and merciless above Gate 17 as Isabel Rourke stood paralyzed. Her boarding pass damp and crumpled in her shaking hand. The final boarding announcement for Flight 447 to Seattle rang through the terminal for the second time. But she couldn't make her legs move. She couldn't stop the tears streaming down her face. She could only stare at the broad back of the man in the sharp black suit walking away from her. Her husband, growing smaller with each purposeful step. The words Vincent Rourke had just delivered still burned in her chest like acid, replaying with cruel precision in her mind. "You're too soft for my world, Isabel. I need you gone so I can think without you constantly reminding me of what I'm trying to protect." She had tried to reach for him, her fingers stretching toward his sleeve, but he had stepped back as though her very presence contaminated him. "Vincent, please. Whatever's happening, we face it together. That's what marriage means." His steel-gray eyes had gone empty, emptier than she'd ever seen them in their 2 years together. Not angry, not conflicted, just void of anything resembling the man she'd married. "What's happening is I made a mistake thinking someone like you could survive in my world. You're not built for this, and I'm done pretending you are. That's not fair. I've never asked you to shield me from anything." "Last call for Flight 447 to Seattle," the gate agent announced, her voice slicing through Isabel's desperate words. Vincent had glanced at the departing passengers filing down the jetway, then back at her with an expression carved from stone, one that would scar itself into her memory forever. "Get on that plane, Isabel. Go to your cousin's place. Figure out who you are without me, but do it far away from here." "You don't mean this." "I mean every syllable. Your ticket's paid for. Your cousin's expecting you. There's money transferred to your personal account. You'll land on your feet." The businesslike efficiency with which he dismantled their marriage, as though he were closing a contract, not destroying a life, had gutted her more completely than rage ever could. Isabel had searched his face desperately for any trace of the man she'd fallen in love with. The one who used to cup her face in his hands and tell her she was the only thing in his world that made sense. But that man had vanished, replaced by this cold stranger with venom in his voice and calculation in his eyes. "I love you," she had whispered. One final attempt to reach through whatever wall he'd constructed between them. Vincent's jaw had clenched, the barest flicker of something human beneath the ice. Then he turned his back on her and walked away without another word, his footsteps echoing against the polished terminal floor like the closing of a crypt. Now Isabel stood alone as the gate agent caught her eye, a gentle but questioning look on her face. This was the moment. Either she boarded the plane and accepted that her marriage had just been executed in public, or she refused to move and forced Vincent to drag her away like unwanted baggage. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Pride made the choice for her. Isabel Rourke had built a life on dignity and self-respect, and she refused to shatter that foundation by begging a man who clearly wanted nothing to do with her. If Vincent needed her gone, she would go. But she would do it on her terms, not as a woman who'd been discarded like yesterday's newspaper, but as a woman who chose to walk away from someone who'd proven himself unworthy of her loyalty. She handed the boarding pass to the gate agent and walked down the jetway on legs that trembled so badly she wasn't sure they'd support her weight. She didn't look back. She didn't allow herself the fantasy that Vincent would come running after her with explanations and apologies. She simply put one foot in front of the other because standing still would have shattered her completely. The aircraft was a Boeing 757, less than half full with scattered business travelers and a few families heading west. Isabel found her assigned seat near the rear, a window position that looked out onto the rain-slicked tarmac where ground crews loaded cargo in the fading afternoon light. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and finally allowed herself to feel the crushing weight of what had just happened. 2 years. 2 years of marriage, and it ended in an airport terminal with the cold brutality of someone canceling a service they no longer required. Isabel closed her eyes and forced herself to remember how it had all begun. before everything twisted into this nightmare. 26 months earlier, the museum fundraiser at the Fairmont Copley Plaza had been her best friend Delilah's doing. "You're turning into a hermit," Delilah had insisted, practically forcing Isabel into a cab. "You curate art for a living, you should occasionally see it outside your office. When was the last time you put on something gorgeous and remembered you're a stunning woman in her late 20s? Not just a workaholic hiding behind inventory spreadsheets." Isabel had attended to appease Delilah, wearing a deep emerald dress that Delilah had called finally acceptable, and heels that made her ankles ache. Her plan had been simple. Stay for exactly 90 minutes, write a check to whatever arts program was being promoted, and escape back to her apartment where she could change into comfortable clothes and finish cataloging the new acquisition that had arrived that afternoon. But then Vincent Rourke had entered the ballroom, and every carefully constructed plan dissolved like sugar in rain. He was imposing, easily 6'3", with dark hair touched with silver at the temples that gave him an air of dangerous sophistication, and eyes that seemed to assess and calculate every element of his environment with lethal precision. He wore his tailored black suit like a weapon, commanding attention without asking for it, drawing every gaze in the room simply by his presence. Vincent had found her within 20 minutes, appearing at her elbow with 2 glasses of champagne and a smile that should have come with a warning label. "You look like you're planning your escape route," he'd said, his voice low and rich with amusement. "Let me guess. You promised a friend you'd show up, and now you're counting down the minutes until you can claim an early morning meeting." Isabel had been so startled by his accuracy that she'd laughed, and that laugh had sealed her fate. He was magnetic in a way she'd never experienced. Vincent didn't just talk to her, he studied her, asked questions about her work curating pre-Columbian art that revealed he'd actually researched the museum before approaching her. He made her feel like the only person in a room full of Boston's elite, and when he'd asked for her number at the end of the night, she'd given it without hesitation. The courtship had been overwhelming. Vincent pursued her with focused intensity, showing up at the museum with coffee that was exactly how she liked it, sending rare books on Aztec sculpture to her office, taking her to restaurants where senators and business moguls nodded to him with careful respect. He had a way of making her feel cherished and protected, his hand always at the small of her back, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings as though ensuring no threat could reach her. "I protect what's mine, Isabel," he told her 3 months in, his thumb tracing her jawline with surprising gentleness. "Always." She'd found it romantic then. Possessive, yes, but in a way that made her feel valued. She overlooked the phone calls he took in other rooms, the business meetings he never discussed, the way certain men approached him with a deference that bordered on fear. Vincent's world was powerful and secretive, but he made her feel safe within it. They married 8 months after meeting, a small ceremony that Vincent insisted on keeping private. "I have enemies in business," he'd explained, kissing her forehead. "The less they know about you, the safer you are." The early months of marriage had been intoxicating. Their penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor was filled with art he'd acquired for her, and Vincent was generous to the point of excess. But there were rules she learned quickly. Don't ask about his work, don't answer the door when he wasn't home, don't mention him to anyone outside their immediate circle. She'd played the compliant wife beautifully, telling herself that every powerful man needed privacy, that his protectiveness was proof of his love. Have you ever ignored warning signs because someone made you feel special? Drop a comment telling me, I think we've all been there. But the absences grew longer. The tension in his shoulders became permanent. And the man who once couldn't stop touching her began treating her like fragile porcelain that might shatter if he held her too tightly. Isabel had felt the distance growing but convinced herself it was temporary, that whatever storm Vincent was navigating in his business world would pass. She'd been wrong about so many things. The meeting that would destroy everything happened on a Tuesday evening in Vincent's private office, a room Isabel had been forbidden to enter without invitation. She'd been in the kitchen preparing dinner when 3 men arrived, associates Vincent never brought to the house. Their voices had carried through the ventilation system, low and urgent. The feds have her name, Vincent. They're building a case, and your wife is their entry point. The voice belonged to Dominic Straza, Vincent's oldest associate, a man whose dead eyes had always made Isabel uncomfortable. They've been watching her for 3 weeks, following her to the museum, documenting every lunch, every phone call. They think she's your weakness. Vincent's response had been too quiet for Isabel to hear, but Dominic's next words came through with brutal clarity. The families made their position clear. She's a liability. You either handle this or they will. And their method won't be as gentle as sending her away. Isabel had frozen at the counter, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might crack her ribs. She'd known Vincent's business wasn't legitimate. She wasn't naive. But the word family carried implications she'd deliberately avoided examining too closely. The threat in Dominic's voice left no room for misinterpretation. "I'll take care of it," Vincent had said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a man sealing his own tomb. "She'll be gone by tomorrow. Far enough that the investigation dies with distance, and the family gets what they want. Make it convincing, Vincent. If she comes back or tries to contact you, we can't protect her. The order will stand. If you think Vincent should have told Isabel the truth instead of lying to protect her, hit that like button. Only people who believe partners should be kept in the dark about death threats won't." After the men left, Vincent had locked himself in his office for 6 hours. Isabel had stood outside the door twice, her hand raised to knock, but something in the deadly silence beyond stopped her. She'd heard the crystal decanter clink against glass repeatedly, heard papers shuffling, heard what might have been a strangled sound of anguish quickly muffled. When he'd emerged near midnight, his eyes had been red-rimmed but dry, his jaw set with terrible resolve. He'd looked at her standing in the hallway like he was memorizing her face for a funeral, then walked past without a word to their bedroom. The next morning he'd told her to pack a bag. They were going to the airport. She'd asked why, asked where, but Vincent had simply stared at her with an expression that made her blood run cold. "Just do what I'm telling you, Isabel. For once, don't question me." She'd packed with shaking hands, sensing that whatever was coming would shatter everything. She hadn't known how right she was. The drive to Logan Airport had been silent except for the rain hammering against the windshield. Vincent's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. His jaw clenched so tightly Isabel could see the muscle ticking beneath his skin. She tried 3 times to ask what was happening, but each attempt died in her throat when she saw the glacial set of his features. When they'd reached the departures terminal, Vincent had handed her a boarding pass he'd printed at home. Seattle. One way. Her cousin Meredith's name and address written on a folded piece of paper tucked inside. "Vincent, what is this? Why are you doing this?" He'd stepped out of the car, pulling her suitcase from the trunk with mechanical efficiency. His movements were precise, controlled, like a man executing a mission he'd rehearsed in his mind until every gesture was perfect. When he finally looked at her, his eyes held nothing but cold dismissal. That's when he'd delivered the lines he'd clearly spent all night crafting. Each word chosen for maximum damage, designed to cut so deeply she'd never think to come back. "You're too soft for my world, Isabel. I need you gone so I can think without you constantly reminding me of what I'm trying to protect." She'd reached for him instinctively, desperately, but he'd stepped back as though her touch might contaminate him. The rejection had been so absolute, so physically painful, that she'd actually gasped. "Vincent, please. Whatever's happening, we face it together. That's what marriage means." His eyes had gone empty then. Not angry, not conflicted, just void. She'd seen him use that expression with business rivals, men he was about to destroy, but never with her. Never with her. "What's happening is I made a mistake thinking someone like you could survive in my world. You're not built for this, and I'm done pretending you are." Every word landed like a physical blow. He'd practiced this, she realized with dawning horror. He'd calculated exactly how to wound her so profoundly that she'd never try to contact him again. The clinical precision of his cruelty was almost more devastating than the words themselves. Comment: partners deserve truth. If you think Vincent's way of protecting Isabel by destroying her was completely wrong. Only people who think lying and emotional abuse are acceptable protection won't comment. When she'd whispered that final "I love you," she'd seen it. The briefest flicker of agony that crossed his face before he locked it down. His jaw had clenched, his hands had curled into fists at his sides, and for one heartbeat she'd thought he might break, might tell her the truth. But Vincent Rourke had committed to this performance completely. He turned his back on her and walked away without a single glance over his shoulder, his footsteps steady and deliberate. Not the walk of a man who just destroyed his marriage, but the walk of a man who'd successfully executed an unpleasant but necessary business transaction. Isabel had stood there watching him disappear, not yet understanding that his cruelty was the price he'd paid to keep her alive. Vincent had made it to Logan Airport in 17 minutes, a drive that should have taken 40. He didn't remember getting in his car or running 3 red lights or the near collision with a taxi at the terminal entrance. He only remembered the crushing weight in his chest that made every breath feel like drowning. The crisis center was chaotic. Weeping family members, grim-faced airline officials, reporters being forcibly removed by security. Vincent had shoved his way to the desk, his voice raw and desperate in a way he'd never allowed it to be in his entire adult life. Isabel Rourke, my wife. She was on flight 447. Where is she? What's happening? The airline representative had looked at him with exhausted sympathy. Sir, we have no new information beyond what's been released to the media. Search and rescue teams are being deployed, but visibility is near zero due to the storm system. We're asking all families to remain here and, I don't want your script. I want to know if my wife is alive. Sir, we simply don't know yet. The plane lost contact approximately 90 minutes ago. We're doing everything we can. Vincent had stood there, a man who controlled empires and commanded fear, rendered completely powerless. Everything he'd built, every connection he'd leveraged, every threat he could make, none of it could reach into the mountains and bring her back. He'd spent the next 16 hours in that terminal, watching news coverage that grew progressively grimmer. Weather experts explaining the severity of the storm system. Aviation analysts discussing worst-case scenarios with clinical detachment. The FAA spokesperson's carefully worded statement that all possibilities remain under investigation. On the second day, Dominic had arrived with information that shattered what remained of Vincent's sanity. The federal investigation's been dropped, Dominic had said quietly, sitting beside Vincent in the hard plastic chairs. Your contact at the Bureau confirmed it. They lost their funding, reassigned the agents. The case against you evaporated yesterday morning. Vincent had turned to look at him, not quite comprehending. The threat's gone, Vincent. It disappeared before her plane even took off. You didn't need to send her away. If you believe Vincent's protection through lies and control was absolutely wrong, hit subscribe. Only people who think keeping your partner in the dark is acceptable won't subscribe. The realization had hit him like a physical blow. He'd destroyed Isabel for nothing. He'd calculated and executed the cruelest possible rejection, had looked into her devastated face and delivered words designed to make her hate him, had walked away from the only person who'd ever made him feel human, all to protect her from a threat that had already vanished. And now she was missing, possibly dead, believing with her last breath that he'd found her too weak to love. Vincent had put his head in his hands and finally let himself break, his shoulders shaking with silent, wrecking sobs that no one in his organization would ever believe the feared Vincent Rourke was capable of producing. He'd killed her to save her from a danger that no longer existed. The guilt was a living thing, eating him from the inside out. The call came at 4:37 in the morning on the 5th day. Vincent had been sitting in the same chair he'd occupied for 96 hours, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused, when the airline representative approached him with an expression that wasn't quite grief. "Mr. Rourke, we've received confirmation. The aircraft has been located. It made a forced landing in a clearing approximately 40 miles east of its last known position. There are survivors." Vincent's heart had stuttered, then exploded into a rhythm so violent he thought it might tear through his chest. "Isabel. Is she?" "We're still confirming passenger identities, but initial reports indicate multiple survivors are being airlifted to Providence Regional Medical Center. You should go there now." He'd been in his car before the representative finished speaking, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the steering wheel. Alive. She might be alive. For days of believing he'd killed her, and now there was a chance. Fragile and terrifying, but real. The hospital's emergency triage area was controlled chaos when Vincent arrived. Medical personnel rushing between ambulances, families being corralled by crisis counselors, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Vincent had pushed through the barriers, his voice hoarse from disuse and desperation. "Isabel Rourke. Where is she?" A nurse had checked her tablet, then pointed toward a staging area where survivors were being evaluated. "She's in Bay 7. She's ambulatory, but she's been through significant trauma. Sir, you need to—" Vincent hadn't waited for the rest. He'd moved toward Bay 7 like a man possessed, his entire being focused on finding her, seeing her, making sure she was real and breathing and alive. And then he'd seen her. Isabel sat on a gurney wrapped in a thermal blanket, her clothes torn and filthy, her hair matted with dirt and what might have been dried blood. Her face was scratched, one eye swollen, her hands bandaged, but she was sitting upright, talking to a medic, gloriously and impossibly alive. "Isabel?" Vincent had breathed, the word half prayer, half sob. She turned at the sound of his voice, and the expression that crossed her face stopped him dead in his tracks. It wasn't relief or joy or even anger. It was something far worse. A cold, exhausted betrayal so profound it made his earlier cruelty look merciful by comparison. The medic had glanced between them, sensing the tension. "Ma'am, is this your husband? He's been here every day waiting for news." Vincent had taken a step forward, his hand reaching for her, desperate to touch her and confirm she was real. "Isabel, thank God. I thought—" "No," Isabel had said, her voice completely flat, devoid of any emotion at all. She'd looked directly at Vincent, and her eyes held nothing but the cold assessment of a stranger examining something distasteful. "No, I don't know him." Then she turned away, dismissing him as completely as if he'd never existed, and continued her conversation with the medic about her injuries. Vincent had stood frozen, his hands still outstretched, as the full weight of what he'd done crashed down on him with devastating finality. He'd saved her life by destroying everything between them, and now she was alive but utterly, irrevocably lost to him. Vincent had found Isabel's cousin Meredith in the family waiting area 3 hours later, her eyes red-rimmed and hostile the moment she saw him approach. "Stay away from her," Meredith had said immediately, standing to block his path. "Whatever you did to her before that flight, she doesn't want to see you. I need 5 minutes to explain. That's all I'm asking." "Explain what?" "That you're the bastard who abandoned his wife at an airport and sent her to her near death alone? She told me what you said to her, Vincent. Every cruel word." Vincent had looked at this woman who barely knew him and made a choice he'd never made before. Complete, unvarnished honesty. "I'm the head of a criminal organization. The federal government was building a case against me using Isabel as their entry point. My family, the people I work with, gave me an ultimatum. Remove her from my life permanently or they would remove her themselves. They meant to kill her, Meredith. I pushed her away to save her life." Meredith had stared at him, her expression shifting from hostility to wary skepticism. "Why should I believe anything you say?" "Because I have proof. Documents, recordings, everything. And because the woman I love thinks I threw her away like garbage. and I need her to know the truth before she spends the rest of her life believing I didn't love her enough to fight for her." Meredith had studied his face for a long moment, then exhaled sharply. "I'll ask. But if she says no, you leave. Permanently." Isabel had agreed to talk, but only in Meredith's hospital room with her cousin present. When Vincent entered, she was sitting in a chair by the window, her bandaged hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully blank. "Tell me everything," Isabel had said without preamble. "Every detail of this threat you're claiming existed. I want names, dates, and proof." So Vincent had told her about Dominic's visit, about the federal surveillance, about the family's ultimatum that he either make her disappear or they would make it permanent. He'd shown her the evidence on his phone: text messages, recorded conversations, documentation of the investigation that had been dropped the morning of her flight. "They would have killed you," Vincent had said, his voice breaking. "Not arresting you, not questioning you. Killed you. And if I'd refused to send you away, they would have killed me too, and then you would have had no protection at all." If you think Vincent should have trusted Isabel with the truth and let her make her own choices about the danger, comment "Equal partners deserve truth." Only people who think women should be protected through deception won't comment. Isabel had listened to everything, her face expressionless, until he finished. Then she'd spoken, her voice quiet and absolutely devastating. "I spent 4 days in that wreckage. The first night, I was trapped in my seat with a broken woman screaming beside me and a dead man in front of me. I kept replaying your words, Vincent. Too soft. Not built for this. A mistake. I believed I was going to die knowing the man I loved had found me worthless." Her voice had cracked then, the first sign of emotion breaking through. "I survived the crash, but I'm not sure I survived what you did to me at the airport." Vincent had spent the next week gathering every piece of evidence that proved the threat was gone. Federal case files obtained through his remaining contacts showing the investigation officially closed. Recorded conversations with his associates confirming the family's ultimatum had been rescinded. Bank records proving he'd already begun liquidating assets tied to criminal enterprises. He'd compiled it all into a folder that felt like both a confession and a plea. When Isabel finally agreed to meet him, 2 weeks after the crash, in a neutral coffee shop far from their old life, she looked different. Thinner, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. But there was something else too, a steel in her spine that hadn't been there before. The crash had broken something in her, but what had grown back was stronger than what had shattered. Vincent had slid the folder across the table. "Everything you asked for. Proof that the threat is over, that the investigation was dropped, that I've started dismantling every connection to the organization. It's all there." Isabel had opened it, reading through each document with the careful attention she used to give museum acquisitions. When she finally looked up, her expression was unreadable. "I need time," she'd said. "Not days or weeks. Months, maybe longer. I need to rebuild myself without you in my space, without your presence influencing every decision I make. Whatever you need. I'm not finished." Her voice had taken on an edge that made Vincent sit up straighter. "If, and this is a massive if, we ever try again, everything changes. We're partners in everything. Your business, your threats, your decisions. I get full transparency or I walk. I am not going to be protected through ignorance again, Vincent. I will not be the delicate thing you hide in a gilded cage while you make life and death decisions about our future without consulting me." Vincent had nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "You don't get to decide what I can handle. I survived 4 days in a crashed plane, Vincent. I'm stronger than you ever gave me credit for. And if you can't see me as an equal partner who deserves the truth, then we have nothing left to rebuild." "You're right," Vincent had said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "You deserved the truth from the beginning. I was wrong to decide for you. Drop a comment if you believe Isabel is 100% right to demand complete transparency and equal partnership." Only people who think partners should be kept in the dark about important decisions won't comment. Isabel had stood to leave, then paused. I'm watching, Vincent. If you're serious about leaving that world, prove it. Get out completely. Build something legitimate. Show me through actions, not words, that you understand what partnership actually means. Vincent had spent the next 6 months doing exactly that. Selling off properties, severing ties with associates, absorbing massive financial losses to extract himself from criminal enterprises that had taken decades to build. It was brutal, costly, and absolutely necessary, because Isabel Rourke had survived a plane crash, and he'd be damned if he wasted her second chance by making the same mistakes that had nearly killed them both. Isabel had returned on a Tuesday evening 9 months after the crash, carrying a single suitcase and a list of non-negotiable terms written on hotel stationery. Vincent had read each one aloud in their living room. Monthly financial disclosures, weekly check-ins about business decisions, complete transparency about all remaining associates, and agreed to every single item without hesitation. The rebuilding had been slow and deliberate, marked by conversations that lasted until dawn and silences that no longer felt dangerous. Vincent learned to share the burden of difficult decisions instead of shouldering them alone. Isabel learned that loving someone didn't mean accepting their worst instincts, but holding them accountable to their best selves. 3 months after her return, Isabel had walked into Vincent's office with a pregnancy test and tears streaming down her face. They'd stood together in that room where he'd once planned her destruction, holding each other and crying for entirely different reasons than they had a year before. Vincent's final meeting with what remained of his organization had been brief and absolute. My wife and child are non-negotiable. Anyone who has a problem with that can consider our association permanently terminated. The men who'd once delivered ultimatums had simply nodded and walked away, recognizing that Vincent Rourke was no longer the man they'd controlled. The legitimate business Vincent built, a security consulting firm, had been moderately successful, but their true legacy came from the community development center they opened in Isabel's 6th month of pregnancy. Built with money that had once funded criminal enterprises, the center provided job training, legal assistance, and second chances to people trying to escape the same world Vincent had left behind. We're building something from the wreckage, Isabel had said at the opening ceremony, her hand resting on her swollen belly, Vincent's arm around her shoulders. Not just for us, but for everyone who needs proof that it's possible to survive the crash and still build something beautiful. Have you ever had to completely rebuild trust with someone after a betrayal? What did it take? Drop a comment. I'd love to hear your story. 5 years later, Vincent sat on their daughter Elena's bed, Isabel beside him as they told her the story, carefully edited for a 4-year-old's understanding, of the airplane and the choice and the lesson they'd learned. Mommy was very brave, Vincent said, tucking the blanket around Elena's small shoulders, and Daddy learned that love means trusting someone with the truth, Isabel added, meeting Vincent's eyes over their daughter's head. Even when the truth is scary. Elena had yawned and curled into her pillow. You fixed it, though. You fixed the broken parts. Vincent had taken Isabel's hand, their fingers interlacing with the practiced ease of 2 people who'd learned that partnership meant facing everything together. The terror, the wreckage, and the slow, miraculous work of rebuilding. Yeah, sweetheart, Isabel had whispered, her voice thick with emotion. We fixed it together, because that's what love was in the end. Not the grand gestures or the protective lies or the sacrifices made in silence. It was the deliberate choice, made every single day, to face the wreckage together and build something stronger from the broken pieces. If you believe love is strongest when built on truth and equal partnership, not lies and control, hit that subscribe button right now. Only people who think Vincent's original way was acceptable won't subscribe. And drop a comment telling me what you thought of Isabel and Vincent's journey. Where in the world are you watching from? I love hearing from you all.